Uh, Morning, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural grand rounds of this academic year. And it's unique in the sense that it's the first grand rounds of the academic year in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the good news is we've got the drill down with respect to the use of WebEx or Zoom or virtual means of conferencing. So it should be as good as in person and maybe even better because you can do it in the comfort of wherever you happen to be now. Um, so nothing new to report about the COVID pandemic and the fact that it's continuing, and at least in New York, uh, getting no worse. And we seem to have things under control for the time being and are awaiting developments with respect to treatments, testing, and a vaccine ultimately. So we'll continue to update people, but at this point, things are progressing, albeit under the continued cloud of the COVID pandemic. But as I said, we've learned to manage. It's not getting worse. It's getting gradually better, but we still have to persevere until we've got the vaccine. Uh, Today, our grand rounds will be given to one of our own faculty, Dr. Guillermo Horga. I will introduce him in a moment, but first I've got some announcements to make, which is all good news. We received a number of NOGAs, Notice of Grant Award. Diana Martinez received a 5-year K-24 from NIDA for a project from scanner to the clinic, patient-oriented research and mentorship. Jeremy Kidd received a K-23 from NIAAA for improving alcohol use disorder treatment for gender minority populations. Lisa Reisenhofer received a K-23 from the NIMH for restrictive and binge eating during adolescence, the role of negative self-related cognitions and self-stress and social stress. And Robert Hawkins received a R01 from NINDS for neurotrophins and consolidation of learning-related synaptic plasticity. And Alice Medalli received a R01 from the NIMH for efficacy of personalized and cognitive remediation for schizophrenia by targeting impairments in early auditory processing. A couple other announcements. Warren Ng, our professor and director of community psychiatry in the hospital, was honored with the newly established Martha Hooven Community Service Award for excellence that honors members of the Columbia P&S faculty who contribute to community service in an exemplary way. And Warren has really been a in terms of his leadership in community service. He was honored for more than 2 decades of community service, ranging from formal patient care to oversight of school-based psychiatry and services and participation in a task force addressing suicide in the community. Also this year, Warren was appointed by Governor Cuomo to serve on the State Behavioral Health Services Advisory Council. Finally, we hold an annual fundraising event called the Gray Matters at Columbia Psychiatry event. It's usually held in the spring at the Plaza Hotel, but in the time of COVID, it's being held virtually, and it will be on September 15th. It's a Tuesday from 11 to maybe 1 p.m. And this year's luncheon, in addition to being virtual, is going to be focused on COVID-19, mental health recovery and resilience, and feature discussions with the chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine, Dr. Angela Mills, and our own Lou Baptista, who's chair of clinical services, but who also pioneered in the development with Claude Mellons and Laurel Mayer, the COPE Columbia initiative, which supported our colleagues in the hospital during the peak of the COVID surge. Also on the program for this event will be comments by our interim dean, Dr. Anil Rusky, and also members of our faculty, Dr. Jennifer Cruz, Christopher Magoon, and Blair Simpson. And then following the prepared remarks and discussion, there will be 3 concurrent breakout sessions for Q&A, 20 minutes long. It'll be concurrent One will be Anne-Marie Albano and Warren Eng on back-to-school coping for children and adolescents. Number 2 will be Terry Goldberg and Brian Fallon, neuroscience and the effects of COVID on the brain. And number 3 will be Jean Marie Bradford, Sidney Hankerson, serving our neighbors, the effects of COVID on communities of color. So those are the things that are happening. I now want to introduce our speaker, who is, as I mentioned, Dr. Guillermo Horga. So I want to take a second just to give like kind of a personal comment about Guillermo and what he exemplifies. So you may have heard me say in the context of different annual meetings or other contexts that coming to Columbia is the opportunity of a lifetime and a lifetime of opportunity. And it truly is a unique one for people that come, are really motivated, talented, hardworking, and dedicated to make this environment work, for them, for the people we serve in our mission. And Guillermo exemplifies it like so many other stories that exist at Columbia. I could go on and on with personal anecdote or personal stories about individuals and how their careers have just been extraordinarily successful by virtue of the opportunities they had in Columbia. So Guillermo hails from Madrid, Spain. He went to medical school and received his medical degree at Miguel Hernandez University. He also did a specialized training in anatomy at Mainz University in Germany, and then received his PhD in experimental neurosciences at the University of Barcelona. And subsequently did a residency at the Psychiatry department in medical school in Barcelona and the Hospital Clinic of Barcelona. He then came to the United States as a postdoctoral fellow with Brad Peterson in imaging. And when Brad left, continued here, but he was a little bit of an orphan. Anissa Abi-Dargham took him into her lab. And then when Anissa went to Stony Brook, he came into the, by then, area Psychosis division to work on psychotic disorders. But, Guillermo, despite, having sort of come and not having had a straight line in terms of mentorship and opportunity, has been extraordinarily productive and successful in a variety of ways. He's currently appointed as the prestigious Florence Irving Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Columbia. So this is a prestigious award that people compete for, that's been in existence and as kind of a stellar group of past recipients. Guillermo, let me just see, I'm trying to rifle through this without having it in front of me. Guillermo's work has focused on the neurobiological and computational mechanisms of psychotic symptoms and schizophrenia and related cognitive functions in health, including inference, learning, and decision-making. Psychosis is characterized by the experience of abnormal perceptions such as hallucinations and delusional beliefs. And while excessive dopamine transmission in the striatum is known to play a role in these symptoms, the cognitive and computational mechanisms mediating psychosis remain unclear. To understand these, research uses behavioral paradigms, computational tools, and a variety of functional and structural molecular in vivo imaging techniques. So his work has been really unique in taking modern technology and applying it to the fundamental questions of what goes on in the brain that causes people to have these disturbances in what would be normal mental functions, perception, cognition, emotional valence, and have those crystallize into what are the symptoms by which we diagnose the disorder. And in doing so, it's garnered attention and also praise from different organizations. He was selected to give a Rising Star Award at the NIMH. He's been the recipient of NIH support for these awards in two areas. One is the computational area, but the other is the validation of biomarkers. Disorders. And also the fact that even though he's currently an associate associate member of the ACNP, he was selected by the incoming president, Linda Brady, to be co-chair of the program committee, which is a very prominent and prestigious appointment, but one which obviously came about through recognition of his scientific talent. So, I go through this by way of introducing him for the purposes of, again, illustrating what I love to keep saying, which is coming to Columbia is a lifetime of opportunity. And Guillermo is certainly somebody who exemplifies making the most of it. So it's a pleasure to have him here today and to speak on dissecting the neural computations underlying psychosis. Please welcome Dr. Guillermo Horga. Guillermo?
Thanks so much, Jeff, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation, Jonathan. I'm very excited to tell you about the work that we do in my lab. So let me share my presentation, make sure that everything is working. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm going to be talking about neural computations underlying psychosis. So my talk will focus on schizophrenia spectrum disorders, but with particular emphasis on one of the symptom domains in schizophrenia, which is psychotic symptoms. And the two main psychotic symptoms are hallucinations and delusions. Hallucinations are defined as false percepts without corresponding stimuli. Delusions are defined as false beliefs that are rigidly held with high conviction despite contradictory evidence. These are two symptoms that tend to correlate across patients, and then they also tend to evolve together within a patient, which is why we call this a syndrome, the psychotic syndrome. And we know that excess striatal dopamine is involved in the generation of this syndrome. What we don't know very well, as Jeff mentioned in the introduction, are the mechanisms linking this alteration in dopamine to the expression of psychotic symptoms. So what I'm going to be talking about is alterations in inference as a potential mediating mechanism linking striatal dopamine and psychosis. And more generally, I'm going to be talking about computation as a bridge between neurobiology and phenomenological experience. And this is an outline of the talk. I'll start by giving you some reasons for the model-based approach that we use in my lab. I'll talk about some relevant inferential models, their application to hallucinations, to delusions. Then I'll try to put that together as an integrative model of the syndrome, the psychotic syndrome as a whole, and I'll end with some future directions. So for this audience in particular, I thought that it was important to give you a bit of a justification or the rationale for this computational theory-driven approach that we use and what it is, and for our focus on individual symptoms and computation. So why do we focus on individual symptoms? The first reason is that individual symptoms are the building blocks of syndromes and disorders, and ideally we would want to have an understanding of psychiatric illness at that level, at the level of these building blocks. Their definition has been stable for long periods. In the case of hallucinations and delusions, they were defined essentially 1 or 2 centuries ago with barely any changes ever since, and compare that to all of the changes in diagnostic categories. And also you could argue that symptoms and syndromes as compared to diagnostic categories are closer to the neurobiology. And we know that, for instance, when we look at the striatal dopaminergic alterations, which track with the severity of psychosis, but do not respect diagnostic categories. This is true in schizophrenia. It's also true in bipolar disorder. So we think that this is a reason to focus on symptoms. And why do we focus on computational theories that drive our research? The reason is that we can start off looking at certain candidate computations that you can think of as brain functions that are used to solve certain problems. But then we can also break that down into its building blocks in an algorithm that comprises latent variables and rules to combine those variables that are used to actually solve the problem. That's how the problem is solved. And if we do this, we can have an understanding of the underlying neurobiology in terms of these latent variables combined. And ideally, we can also have an understanding of psychiatric manifestations at that level, at the level of these underlying latent variables. And this helps us look for much more specific neurobehavioral signatures, not of the function, but of the particular variables in the algorithm. And once we have a candidate algorithmic alteration that I'm going to be calling algorithmic failure mode, we can also perform quantitative simulations of the process giving rise to the symptoms, which I'll argue that is important because it gives us some mechanistic insights into the process of generation of these manifestations. So altogether, I think this is a very important approach because it allows us to integrate our understanding across these different levels of analysis. And because I'll argue later that this allows for better back translation and forward translation. So we're going to talk about altered inference as a mediated mechanism between dopaminergic alterations and psychosis. As a starting point, we know that there are semi-parallel circuits that are innervated and modulated by dopamine. It's not just one circuit. And this comprises essentially corticostriato-thalamocortical circuits that subserve different functions. Initially, in the literature, the focus was heavily on the limbic circuit, partly because we understood it better. We understood that part of the functions of dopamine in this circuit was to signal our reward learning signals. And that was very influential on the earlier models of psychosis. But as molecular in vivo imaging techniques got better, more and more evidence converged to suggest a prominent role of the associative circuit in the pathophysiology of psychosis. And in particular, it showed increased dopamine transmission at the level of the associative striatum. And this is part of this associative circuit, which receives dopamine projections from parts of the substantia nigra and receives also input from various parts of the cortex, and mostly from associative cortices such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsal anterior cingulate, but also some other parts of parietal cortex, associative sensory cortex that I'll go through later on. Okay, so one of the functions that is observed by this circuit that seems to be relevant to psychosis, given its its prominent perceptual alterations that are defined of the defining of the syndrome, is perceptual inference. And the idea here is that the brain doesn't just passively respond to stimuli in the environment. This is because stimuli are always conveyed with some level of noise or uncertainty, and the brain needs to use a mechanism to resolve that uncertainty. And so the brain is thought to do so by leveraging prior knowledge to reduce that uncertainty and generate estimates about the stimuli in the environment and their underlying causes. And this estimation process is what's called perceptual inference. And perceptual inference is best summarized mathematically by this algorithm, which is essentially Bayes' theorem or Bayesian inference. Applied to this particular context of perception, we can think of these terms in the following way. The blue term here is the neosensory data, which is the probability of evidence given a particular hypothesis. The prior knowledge represents the a priori probability of that hypothesis. And in this context, the percept results from the combination of those two. The percept is essentially a normalized aggregation of those two sources of evidence. And what this says is that percepts are not only driven by sensory inputs, but those are modulated by prior knowledge. So depending on your prior knowledge, you might perceive things differently. And to illustrate that, I'm gonna play a clip. If you can turn up the volume to make sure that you hear it clearly, that would be great. So I'm going to play an audio clip, like I said, that you can think of as the sensory data, which is going to be degraded and a little hard to hear. Then I'm going to play a clip, which is a clean version of the same stimulus. And then when I play the first one again, the sensory data, the degraded sensory data, you will probably perceive it differently because you'll be using your prior knowledge as a template for what to expect, and probably that'll help you reduce some of the uncertainty. So, okay, so here's the first degraded clip. A clean sample.
Oh, it's quite slippery.
And again, the first one. So hopefully if you could hear that well, the second time you listened to the first clip, it was clear and you could tell what the person was saying, even though it was degraded. And that's I'm using this things.
Guillermo, do that again because I think people might not have had their sound turned up loud enough to hear it, but play it just
Okay.
do it once.
Okay, so here's the first clip. Clean version.
Oh, it's quite slippery.
And first clip again. So hopefully if you could hear that, you know, this exemplifies this process. Okay. When we turn this same exact formula that I showed you into a different space, which is log odds ratio space, we can see that it's essentially just a sum. It's adding up the likelihood or the sensory evidence and the prior knowledge, which is also called prior belief. And the sum of those two components gives rise to the posterior belief, which again is equivalent to the percept. And if we think of this in an iterative fashion, where someone is perceiving or receiving different pieces of evidence, we can see that it's essentially a process of accumulation of evidence over time, or temporal integration. And so this is not just an abstract concept, because there's been lots of electrophysiological research in different species suggesting that the associative circuit, including the cortical components like parietal cortex and the associative striatum, actually exhibit a signature of this process of temporal integration. Okay, so we think that the brain is doing something like this. So why is this relevant to hallucinations? So it's relevant to hallucinations because the first algorithmic model of hallucinations that was proposed was very related to this process. And I'm changing here the formula slightly to make it about inferences on continuous stimuli, for instance, the magnitude or the duration of a stimulus. And we can see still the same players. We can have the same latent variables that are used in this algorithm. So new sensory data and the prior knowledge, but you can see that they're weighted. They have this omega weights. And so what are those weights? In this context of sensory data, which would be the width of that blue distribution, and the uncertainty associated with the prior expectation. The prior expectation would be the mean of the red distribution, and its uncertainty would be the width. And the idea here is that the ideal way to combine these two sources of information is just a weighted sum of the sensory information and the prior expectations. But this weighted sum would depend on their relative reliability. So if the sensory data is noisier and therefore less reliable, more uncertain, it's going to be used less, and the percept is going to be less influenced by sensory data and more by prior expectations. If prior expectations are more uncertain, then they will be used less in this process, and the percept will be closer to sensory data further away from expectations. Okay. So again, this is important for hallucinations because the first algorithmic model to explain hallucinations that was proposed by Carl Friston suggested that what might be going wrong in the brains of patients with hallucinations is that they underestimate the uncertainty associated with prior expectations. And their brain represents these prior expectations as as they had too little uncertainty, or they're overly precise. And so what would happen here is that the prior expectation would drive perception. So percepts might be too close to expectations and too far from reality, or too far from the sensory data. So this is a theory that we found very appealing, and we wanted to test this. This was work that Cliff Cassidy, a postdoc with me, worked on. And so how we tried to test this is in the following way. The prior expectations should be modified depending on how variable stimuli are in the environment. So if we have a context where there's very low variance, for instance, we have stimuli of different durations, but the duration is not that different, so there's low variance here, that should lead to low uncertainty in the priors. So we should have a fairly certain expectation, and again, that should drive percepts. But if we're in a context where there's a lot more variability, the prior expectations should capture that and should be represented with more uncertainty. This is in normal conditions, and therefore they should be less influential on perception. But in the hypothesized case for hallucinations, we might have an alteration here. And if the prior expectations are always represented with excessive certainty, that might not be that obvious in a low variance context, but will be more obvious in a high variance context, because prior expectations might not be represented with the appropriate level of uncertainty that they should have. So they will continue to be excessively influential on perception, even in a variable context. So to test that hypothesis, we developed a task that is a tone reproduction task, where participants listen to 1000 hertz pure tone of 700 milliseconds, and they just had to reproduce the duration of that target tone, which was almost always the same, okay? And they had to reproduce it by stopping a playback of the tone. They heard the target tone and they had to reproduce it immediately after. But importantly, the target tone was preceded by context tones that set up the expectations. And the context tones could have different duration to the target tone. In this case, they're longer. These are 3 context tones that are longer than the target tone. And they're exactly the same duration, the context tones that is, so they have low variance. And we also manipulated the variance within the context tones, within that train of context tones. So in the example on the bottom, you can see that the first context tone is a little longer than the second, which is a little shorter than the third. But on average, both the top and the bottom rows had context tones that were had a longer mean than the target. So the idea here was to have a parametric manipulation whereby by changing the context mean, we would induce an illusion of duration of the tone. And by manipulating the context variance, we would manipulate the strength of that illusion. And I'm going to show you a concrete example so this makes sense to you. Okay, so this is an example in one subject performing this task. And what I'm showing you is how this subject is reproducing the target tones, which are all 700 milliseconds, as a function of the context mean. So you can see that the subject is reproducing the target tones as longer when they're preceded by longer context means, and as shorter when they're preceded by shorter context means, okay? And this is in the low variance context, and this is what we would expect from this model, because in Bayesian inference, the percept should be somewhat in between the actual duration, which is 700, and the expected duration based on the context. So the context mean. And in this case, again, there's low uncertainty around those expectations. In the situation with more uncertainty, with high variance, this should be reflected on prior expectations with more uncertainty that should drive the percept less so. So this slope that we saw initially, which captures the illusion, should be flattened. And this change between the slopes in the low versus the high variance context should capture this adjustment of the effect of prior expectations based on context variance. So again, if we're in a situation of someone who suffers from hallucinations, these two contexts might be registered in a more similar way. And so the prior expectations, even under the high variance context, might be represented with excessive certainty and might still drive strongly perception. So this predicts that the uncertainty of adjustment in patients with severe hallucinations would be smaller. Okay. So to test that hypothesis, we collected data from this task in a group of patients with schizophrenia who are unmedicated. And this is exactly what we saw in these patients. You can see that patients with more severe hallucinations on the y-axis, measured by the PANSS, tend to have lower uncertainty adjustment as predicted. And this is a strong effect, a specific effect. It was specific to hallucinations compared to other symptoms. And this was not merely driven by lack of attention or lower level alterations in performance. They were generally just as accurate. And they actually had stronger influence of the context in general, meaning that they were paying attention to the task equally, but they had this decreased uncertainty adjustment.
Guillermo, excuse me for interrupting, but is this similar? So in studies of placebo effects in clinical trials research, Brett Rutherford, Steve Roos previously described it in terms of expectancy bias. Is this is your perceptual inference basically a specific kind of expectancy bias?
Yeah, so the placebo effects have been definitely framed from this perspective, and yeah, what I'm calling this increased reliance on the prior, you can think of it as an expectation bias. But here, the expectation is not necessarily an explicit expectation, like therapeutic expectations of a patient undergoing a treatment, but a more implicit expectation of the system. Like the brain is adjusted to expect certain things from the context, and it responds to sensory information in a way that is modulated by those expectations. It's a little more implicit, but it's fairly similar. So this suggests that the framework that I proposed initially, where we started, might capture some reality. We see some alterations in inference at this lower level of inference on estimation of the duration of a stimulus. That seems to be related to the severity of hallucinations, and specifically so. But we're breaking down inference and talking about a particular algorithm and a latent variable in that algorithm, and a particular failure mode, which is increased reliance or increased weighting on that variable, which is the prior expectations. So, okay, so is excess striatal dopamine related to this? Is this a dopamine dependent alteration? And I started at the beginning talking about the associative striatum. We think that is particularly relevant to the expression of psychosis. So to test this hypothesis, we conducted a PET experiment, and we measured dopamine release capacity in the associative striatum specifically. What we did here was to use the radiotracer raclopride, which binds D2 receptors in the striatum, and we compared a baseline condition and a post-amphetamine condition. So we looked at the changes in binding potential in D2 receptors, which essentially tells you how much dopamine was released under amphetamine. So this is a measure, again, of dopamine release capacity. And dopamine release capacity is increased in psychosis in this area of the striatum. So we hypothesized that increased displacement of raclopride or dopamine release capacity in the x-axis would be associated with lower uncertainty adjustment, which is what we saw in relation to hallucinations. And this is, again, what we saw. And we saw this actually both in patients and in controls. This was an effect that was significant in both groups independently, suggesting that the dopamine in this area of the striatum is involved in this process of perceptual inference. So this seems to work out so far. We have a dopamine-dependent alteration in inference that is related to hallucinations. And this way of thinking about dopamine is based on a lot of prior work into the algorithmic effects of neuromodulators, including dopamine, as changing, as modulating the gain in different sources of information, and also modulating different types of reward learning signals. And we can talk more about that if you're interested later on. Another thing that I mentioned, there was a particular strength of what I perceive as a strength of this approach is once we have a candidate algorithmic failure mode, we can make quantitative simulations of the process underlying the symptom. And in this case, with this particular failure mode, again, increased reliance on priors that are excessively certain, we can simulate false percepts. And the basic concept here is that the likelihood that I was talking about in Bayesian inference models is not simply the likelihood of a stimulus, but it is the internal representation in the brain of that likelihood, which will be conveyed by neurons firing. And those neurons are going to be firing, sensory neurons are going to be firing regardless of whether there's an objective stimulus that is present or not. There's always going to be some level of firing. So this algorithm also applies to situations where there's no stimulus, there's completely absent stimulus, and can also be used to simulate false percepts, which we discussed in more detail in this review in the bottom. And other people have done a lot of detailed work with this type of simulations. All right. So what is the circuit level implementation of this type of alterations in inference? I told you that the first clue was that the PET study suggesting an involvement of the associative circuit, but I haven't shown you any brain data suggesting an involvement of this circuit beyond the associative striatum. So first clue came from this same study where we looked at gray matter volumes, and we saw that participants with less uncertainty adjustment tended to have less gray matter volume in the dorsal anterior cingulate, which is a region that is partly involved in or part of this associative circuit. And we know it's functionally involved in registering changes in the variability in the environment and helping adjust inference and learning based on that from previous work. So this definitely seems like an area that would be relevant in principle. Also, this connects with prior work that we did with task-based fMRI, measuring how the response to speech stimuli in a speech discrimination task was modulated by the context. And again, this model suggests that the brain shouldn't just respond to speech stimuli when they're present versus when they're absent, but the stimulus strength should be modulated by the context and the expectations. So we can see this, if we rearrange this formula, we can see that essentially the change in beliefs from the prior to the posterior belief is essentially a form of weighted sensory prediction error. So it is as if the response to the sensory data is modulated based on the prior expectations. So we're subtracting prior expectations. And under this particular model of hallucinations that we were testing, we would expect decreased belief updating, so slower belief updating, or equivalently, sensory prediction errors that are that have less weighting in the brain, that are weaker essentially, that have lower scaling in the brain. And that's exactly what we found in this fMRI study, comparing patients with severe hallucinations and healthy controls. We first saw that the response to speech is clearly modulated by the context as a form of speech prediction error, and that the scaling of that speech prediction error was decreased in patients compared to controls in speech selective regions of the associative auditory cortex. So this is still consistent with this idea that there's an involvement in the associative circuit, and I'm saying this because I'm considering these higher order regions of auditory cortex, like speech sensitive regions of auditory cortex compared to earlier auditory cortex regions, as part of the associative circuit with DLPFC, parietal cortex, some parts of the ACC, etc. And we know from track tracing studies in non-human primates that these regions also project to the head of the caudate and a key part of the associative striatum. So this is well known anatomically. Another relevant study that shed some light into the circuit implementation was a resting state connectivity study that we did, where we looked at rest at the correlations in activity between different parts of the striatum and the rest of the brain. And mainly we focused on the associated striatum, and we looked at different subregions of the associated striatum and other parts of the striatum. But what you can see here is that in healthy controls, the blue regions are regions that are strongly connected to the anterior caudate, which is part of the associated striatum, suggesting that this circuit, this is part of an associated circuit, which includes, again, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, parietal regions, auditory regions, and medial prefrontal regions that was associated with this part of the striatum. And importantly, we found disruptions in this connectivity in patients with schizophrenia, a medicated patient with schizophrenia, particularly so in those with severe psychosis and those with more severe dopaminergic dysfunction.
This is resting state connectivity?
Yeah. Yeah, so these are just the correlations in activity between those parts of the striatum, which are the seeds, and the rest of the boxes in the brain. And we saw a predominant disruption in this blue network that correlated with severity of psychosis and dopamine dysregulation. So all of this is suggestive of an involvement of the associative circuit in psychosis. And in particular, in this, it fits with this idea of alterations in inference that are subserved by the circuit. So, all right, so how do I account then for other individual symptoms of the psychotic syndrome? I started here talking about these two symptoms, hallucinations and delusions. And I think that it's useful to think about them arranged in this way hierarchically, with delusions on top and hallucinations on the bottom. And that's because we typically think of inference also as a hierarchical process of regions in the brain performing different levels of inference that are interrelated, which is why it's called a hierarchical process. So the lower level processes might have to do with estimation or inference on different states of the stimulus, like for instance, the presence or absence of the stimulus, or the different features of the stimulus. And the higher levels of inference might deal with the hidden causes of those stimuli that we observed. So the interpretation or the hidden state that gives rise to our observations. And I'll give you an example of this. If we're walking around on a day like today, we might feel something on our skin, and we might not be sure if it's a water droplet or not, which is felt. Okay, so we might have to do first this type of inference, which is essentially a signal detection problem. Did we just feel a water droplet or not? And depending on the answer to that, we might start thinking that it's raining, obviously. But if it was a sunny day and we're walking in downtown Manhattan, or close to the Hammer building, we might think that this is coming from an AC unit which is leaking. So these are two different levels of inference. First, is there a water droplet at the level of that stimulus that we felt? And second, what is its explanation? And they are interrelated, obviously. So one potential explanation for psychosis, the psychotic syndrome, is that there are symptom-specific pathways and alterations in inference at lower levels, the level of the stimulus, might give rise to hallucinations. I showed you some evidence suggestive of this in the study that I talked about, because that was about inference on the duration of the stimulus, so it was a stimulus feature. And alterations at higher levels of inference might give rise to delusions. So that could explain why those symptoms tend to go together, because inference is hierarchical at different nested levels, and alterations in one level of inference are typically going to affect other levels of inference. So when we have alterations in inference, it's likely that they'll go together and they'll produce both symptoms together. So this would suggest that the correlation that we observe clinically is epiphenomenal and is actually generated by the correlation at the brain level between the different levels of inference. in the brain systems that support them. So I'm going to talk first about some evidence that we have linking alterations in higher level inference to delusions. So this is work that was led by Seth Baker, a former RA in the lab. What we decided to do was to make a variant of a classic task called the beats task. And so in this task, for those of you who are not familiar with it, we asked participants to draw from a hidden jar, and they're drawing beads that have different colors. So they're drawing these beads from the jar, and at some point they have to decide what's the identity of that hidden jar. They draw them from a jar which is mostly filled with green beads, the green jar, or from a jar which is mostly filled with blue beads, the blue jar. And importantly, you can solve this problem again through Bayesian inference. But this type of Bayesian inference, it's the exact same algorithm that I showed you earlier, but it's a different level of inference, because in this case, we're trying to infer which of two hypotheses is more likely. The hypothesis that we're drawing from the green jar versus the hypothesis that we're drawing from the blue jar. And that's based on the evidence provided by the beads that were observed. So it's not inference at the level of the stimuli or the beads, it's inference at the level of hidden state, which is the jar. And that's why I'm calling that higher level inference. And so what we hypothesize here is that we would have a similar failure mode, but at this different level. We would also have increased reliance on the prior beliefs during the test. And this is how we tested that hypothesis. We developed this variant of the beats task where participants were endowed $30 of actual money. And we told them that they could draw beads and it would cost them 30 cents per bead. And then at some point they would have to guess the identity of the hidden jar. And if they guessed that incorrectly, we would subtract $15 from the endowment. So they were clearly motivated, and they were highly motivated to get it right? So we wanted them to draw more and be very motivated to do the task and very engaged. The two basic behaviors that we got out of this task was on a draw-by-draw basis, we asked them to produce a probability estimate report where they reported on a visual analog scale how likely was it that they thought they were drawing from either the blue jar or the green jar. And you can see this here in the second window. And then we asked them to decide whether they wanted to continue drawing and paying for that bead, or whether they wanted to guess at that point and risk making an error. And at each draw, we saw them, we showed them the draws they had taken so far. And we also showed them the mixture in the jars. So what was the majority to minority ratio of the beads in the hidden jar? Which is essentially equivalent to the strength of the sensory evidence, because if you have jars that have 50-50 majority to minority ratio, it would be impossible to know which jar you're drawing from. So the closer this ratio is to 50-50, the weaker the sensory evidence. And this is the behavior that we got after we obtained data in a group of patients with schizophrenia with different levels of delusions, some of whom were medicated, some others were unmedicated. But all of the results that I'm going to tell you about hold in the medicated subgroup, which is about half of the sample. So the first thing that we saw here, we're measuring draws decision on the y-axis, how many draws they take before making a guess. And we saw that this was increased as the majority to minority ratio or probability of majority bead color became smaller. So when there was weaker sensory evidence, they took more beads to make a guess. But importantly, we saw that that adjustment over the different conditions on the x-axis was accentuated in patients with more severe delusions, measured here by the Peters delusion inventory. And this was very specific to delusion severity. We didn't see this effect for alterations in perception, in hallucination-like phenomena. And we even actually saw this effect for delusions, even controlling for hallucinations, which are correlated. We also looked at a number of other variables, sociodemographic variables, work memory performance, illness duration, other symptoms, and we only saw this effect in relation to delusion severity or measured in different ways. But critically here, our hypothesis was about alterations in inference, and Drost's decision is not a direct measure of inference. So here what we did was to focus on the probability estimates that the patients reported during the task, where they're telling us how strongly they believe they're drawing from the actual hidden jar versus the other jar. And what we could see here when we just averaged across different sequences, and we looked specifically at the 60-40 jar trials, which are the trials where we saw the strongest effect in Drost's decision, is that the change in beliefs or these probability estimates was slower in high delusion patients compared to low delusion patients and controls, suggesting this slower belief updating that I said that would be a consequence of the hypothesized model of psychosis. But this is not the best way to analyze it. And what we did here was to actually fit a version of this model with two explicit parameters here. There were weights on the prior beliefs and a weight on the likelihood. We fitted this to the data on a subject by subject basis. And we were actually able to capture the data pretty well, compare this to many other models, and this was the best model for a number of different metrics. But importantly, this captured the group differences, and we could then look at subject by subject parameters indicating the reliance on the prior and the reliance on the likelihood. So only the parameter indicating higher reliance on the prior, this omega p, was correlated with the severity of delusions. And it was also correlated with how much adjustment in Drost's decision subjects had. So this parameter, this particular failure mode in this belief updating or patient inference algorithm was what seemed to explain the delusion effects, both at the level of Drost's decision and just the clinical severity of delusions. And again, here at a more computational level, this effect was fairly specific because we didn't see this for other weights that indicate alterations in inference, like the likelihood weight here. And we also didn't see inter-individual variability that correlated with delusions for a number of other parameters that indicate not how inference evolves over time, how beliefs evolve over time during the task or on a draw-by-draw basis, but more so what the participants decide to do with that information. If they strongly believe that they figure out the hidden jar, but maybe they have other parameters that indicate how variable their choice is, or how much subjective cause they attribute to drawing, which also will affect the draw decision behavior. So those other parameters, those other value-based decision and choice parameters were not related to delusions, and neither were a number of other parameters related to loss aversion, risk aversion, etc. So this suggests that there's a specific alteration in inference, and in particular, increased reliance on prior that was related to delusions specifically. Okay. So why do we think this is important? Again, I told you earlier that what we like about this approach is that then you can make fairly specific predictions and simulations. So I'm going to show you a simulation here, suggesting that this particular algorithmic failure mode captures what we think is critical features that are defining of delusions. So what are the critical features of delusions? From the initial definitions, the main two features of delusions that we think are pretty much necessary for Collins sentiment delusion are rigidity and high certainty. Falsity was another criterion, but it was always questioned and never considered necessary or sufficient. So we want to mostly try to capture rigidity and high certainty in beliefs as defining features of delusions. So I'm going to show you here a simulation of an agent with agents with different levels of weight on the prior, this omega p parameter. And you can think of this as a subject who's doing the base test, but instead of having a few draws, they're having many, many draws. And the y-axis is the probability of the correct hidden state. So you can think of this as, for instance, the blue jar. Let's say that the blue jar is the one that is generating the samples or the beats. And on top, you see black dots that correspond to observing blue beats, consistent with that correct hidden jar. And on the bottom, you're seeing also black dots that are corresponding to green beats in this case. So inconsistent with the true hidden state generating the data. You can also think of this as, someone who's an undecided voter is trying to decide whether the correct person to vote for is either Biden on top or Trump on the bottom. And they're receiving information from the media, and what we see here in the blue trajectory of beliefs is how their beliefs are changing over time as a function of the information that they're receiving. Okay, so you can see here a fair amount of variability in this trajectory. And as a reference, this is a subject with low weighting of the prior. Okay, and you can see here in the background that how close the probability is to 1 or to 0 tells you how certain that belief is. So if someone is completely certain that they're drawing from the blue jar, that would be a probability of 1. So now I'm going to show you someone who has increased prior weight, which is what we saw in patients with delusions. And you can right away see that the trajectory of beliefs is fairly different. The dynamics of those beliefs are different. Right away, you can see that at sort of the asymptote here, the first thing that is different is that the certainty of beliefs, so how extreme the beliefs are, is higher for the subject who has higher prior weighting, like the delusion patients. And then you can also see here at the beginning to the left, I'm not sure if you're seeing my cursor, that the adjustment to evidence is also slower and more rigid. So you can see here towards the left that both simulated agents are starting to think that the more likely scenario is the bottom one, but then they start receiving a lot of information suggesting the opposite. So they change the course of their beliefs. But you can see that the red one, it's a more sluggish trajectory. It takes longer to adjust. So it has slower belief updating and a more rigid trajectory that is responding less to the evidence. So this is showing that with this algorithmic failure mode, you can capture two key aspects of delusions, the rigidity and the high certainty. And this is work that is being followed up by Brandon Ashenoff, a postdoc in the lab, as well as Nick Singletary, who's a PhD student. Okay, so this is what I've shown you so far. I've shown you some evidence suggesting that alterations in inference related to lower level inferences, in particular increased reliance at that level on priors, related to hallucinations, increased reliance on priors at higher levels of inference is related to delusions. So the idea here is that we have a similar algorithmic failure mode, but at different levels with different computational goals. Either higher level inferences on hidden states causing observed stimuli, or lower levels that have to do with features of the stimuli. And I've shown you some data suggesting that this is a dopamine-dependent process, and that there's an involvement of associative cortical subcortical circuits. Great. What I haven't shown you is any evidence for this hierarchical framework as a whole, looking within the same patients at delusions, hallucinations, and different hierarchical levels of inference, or at least different hierarchical levels neurally. And so this is a very recent study that we're working on and is under review. To understand the premise here, I'll take you back to a concept that I raised at the beginning of the talk, which is that you can think of Bayesian inference as temporal integration of information over time. And this is supported by brain systems that have the ability to sustain neural activity. So an index of this can be measured through resting state fMRI signal in a method that was recently developed by simply taking the autocorrelation function of the brain signal in a certain part of the brain and looking at how fast does it decay. Or equivalently, you can take the area under the curve in the positive period of the autocorrelation function. But this essentially is just telling you how much that area is able to sustain activity for longer or shorter time periods. And so this method, as I said, was validated, and it was shown to capture hierarchies in the brain of shorter to longer timescales. So the areas here in red are areas that sustain activity for longer periods of time, and are typically the regions that we think about as associated regions that are involved in this type of inference. And this was work that was led by Ken Wengler, who's a postdoc in the lab. So what Ken did here was to reproduce this method, look at different samples, including the HCP sample, and a publicly available set of data sets of patients with resting state data who had schizophrenia. So we can see here in the top map that we are reproducing those same hierarchies of neural timescales, again, from shorter to longer timescales in red. What we did was to look at well-defined hierarchies in the brain in different systems, in the auditory system, in the violet colors, in the visual system in green, and in the somatosensory system in orange. And this is a flattened view of the brain that shows different parcels with different coloring representing the different levels of the hierarchy. And these dark regions here represent downstream regions that are common higher level projections from each of these hierarchies. But importantly, what we hypothesized here, again, going to the framework, was that alterations related to hallucinations would predominate in lower levels of the hierarchy, and alterations related to delusions would predominate in higher levels of the hierarchy. And this is what we found. I'm going to explain this to you. You can see here in the x-axis different levels of the hierarchy, and this is for the auditory system in particular, which had the clearest effects of the different that we examined. On top, you can see the hallucination effect. So essentially, patients with more severe hallucinations had longer neural timescales, the relatively longer timescales that predominated in lower levels of the hierarchy. So lower levels here towards the left of the x-axis. And in contrast, patients with more severe delusions tend to have relatively higher neural timescales in the higher levels of the hierarchy. And these hierarchical gradients were both significant and significantly different from each other within the same patients in this combined data set, which comprised about 130 patients with schizophrenia. And this was, again, measured from the resting state fMRI data in these patients. We also saw this effect in the somatosensory cortex, but again, it was stronger here in the auditory system. But most importantly, we could recapitulate this effect using a biophysical model where we produced alterations in either the lower levels of the hierarchy that we showed that it recapitulated the effects associated with hallucinations, or we could also selectively disrupt higher levels of the hierarchy. And by doing so, we reproduced the effects associated with delusions in terms of INTs, so the effects that I'm showing on the right. And it's not so relevant here, but what we did, the alterations that recapitulated these findings were increasing recurrent excitation at a given level of the hierarchy. So this is where I started the talk, looking at altered inference in a more abstract way. And I proposed this framework that is a hierarchical framework, first starting by dissect the different symptoms that comprise the psychotic syndrome, and then divide up inference into different levels of different nested levels of inference that are interrelated. And I showed you some evidence suggesting that this excess trial dopamine can be associated with alterations at lower levels of inference that are linked to hallucinations. I haven't showed you any direct evidence suggesting that alterations in dopamine is linked to alterations in inference at higher levels that are related to delusions, but this is something that we're testing now. But importantly, what I want you to take from this is that we're trying to systematically dissect the syndrome and the potential underlying computational mechanisms by looking at different levels of inference. Within a level of inference, we're trying to also break that down into building blocks, which are the different variables that are used in the inferential algorithm. And once we have detected a particular latent variable that seems to explain one of these two symptoms, we can then reconstruct or simulate the generative process of that symptom. And so what we're doing now is to try to test all of these paths to try to understand this more fully. And one of the things that we're doing, which is related to what Jeff mentioned in the introduction, is doing this with a more scalable MRI proxy method for dopamine function, which is called neuromelanin sensitive MRI. And what we're doing here is we're imaging the midbrain, and we're looking at a signal that we have validated to reflect the concentration of neuromelanin in that area. And we know from work from Dave Sulzer and others that neuromelanin is a metabolite of dopamine and other catecholamines, and that with increased synthesis of dopamine, as in psychosis, there should be more accumulation of neuromelanin in midbrain dopamine neurons. So we have validated this measure against PET measures of dopamine release capacity, and we have also seen that patients with more severe psychosis tend to have higher neuromelanin MRI signal in the substantia nigra, suggesting that they have more accumulation of neuromelanin here. So using this technique that we have validated, we're trying to test this model more fully. And in particular, we're targeting higher and lower levels with specific tasks and similar models to what I showed earlier. We're measuring the symptoms in as much detail as we can. And we're also measuring neuromelanin sensitive MRI to put all of this together. One thing that I wanted to say is that we don't think that all of this is related necessarily to dopamine, as in dopamine excess is not always going to be a necessary alteration driving this process, but it can be a sufficient one. We know, however, that many other neurotransmitters are going to be involved at many different levels. And we think of dopamine as an upstream process. And for sure, the combination of these different variables, different levels of inference, are going to require glutamatergic signals and GABAergic signals. And potentially, there's involvement of other neuromodulators like acetylcholine and others. I told you earlier that we thought this was particularly important because it might help back translation, might help focus preclinical models. And we think so because we are really trying to get at the core process generating hallucinations. And once we have that, that means that we'll have a specific paradigm, specific model to look at that. And we can use computation as a bridge and the same type of model-inspired paradigms to then look at that in preclinical models, for instance, in rodent models. And there's actually some data suggesting that this is a very fruitful approach. And in particular, I'm highlighting here work from the Kepex lab, from Katerina Schmack, who using this type of signal detection paradigm and looking at the emergence of false percepts in rodents, have been able to relate and causally link alterations in dopamine in particular circuits in the dopamine system, which are not the limbic ventral circuits, but circuits that are relevant to perception, to the generation causally of false percepts. So we think that this is a super interesting model that might be very, very important for better understanding in more detail the cellular and molecular pathways associated with this process. And then we also think that this is very relevant for forward translation. Part of it is that we're trying to break down this process into its individual components. And if we know exactly what are the specific levels of inference and the brain systems that support that, that means that we'll be able to target those systems in a more specific, selective way. Not only with pharmacology, but also with systems levels approaches, such as neurostimulation, for instance. We might know that, for instance, the particular high level process in DLPFC might be more relevant to delusions, and we might be able to target that with as an anatomical target. But we also might be able to target the computational process itself through cognitive training or different types of neurofeedback. And this is something that we're working on now in collaboration with different groups. And we're particularly focusing on a type of neurofeedback called decoded neurofeedback, which has shown in healthy people that can be used to modulate things like perceptual confidence in specific directions by learning, by a person learning in the scanner to modulate a pattern of activity in a particular direction. So we think that this is why this is also important for forward translation and developing new treatments. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm going to thank my lab, all of the amazing and super talented people in my lab that made this work possible, all of my great collaborators and all of the opportunities I've had at Columbia and NSP, and all of my collaborators outside of Columbia, particularly Inisa Bidargam, who, as Jeff mentioned, was my mentor and has been now a collaborator, and other collaborators as well, such as Nathaniel Don, and of course my funding sources, like NIMH in particular. Thanks to all of you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Guillermo. That was terrific.
Okay.
It's it's a huge challenge to present computational modeling to an audience such as myself that's computationally naive, and make it understandable and still do justice to the complexity of the field. And you really did a superb job with that. So thank you so much for educating us all.
Thank you.
I had one question that I was going to start out with. I realize that no single model can explain all aspects of a symptom or a syndrome or a phenomenon. So to some extent, this is a bit unfair. But if I understand your model correctly, you're trying to understand hallucinations as a product of overvaluing of priors and a certain rigidity about priors. Mm-hmm. And that, I would imagine, should be, at least in theory, should be invariant to the sensory modality. I guess I'm wondering your thoughts about why hallucinations seem to be specific to one sensory domain for any given syndrome.
Yeah, so that's a very important question. So, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that, the approach that I try to take is starting with phenomenology. And, if you know about psychosis and schizophrenia, you know that auditory hallucinations are the most common and are the most severe, right? And, this has been reported many times. In more recent studies, they actually compared severity and prevalence, and this seems to be the case. And this is different to other psychotic conditions, such as psychosis and Parkinson's disease or other neurological conditions. So it suggests actually to me that there's something that might be particularly disrupted in the auditory modality. We don't know exactly why, but it might be that, since inference here is about resolving uncertainty in different, sensory inputs, we know that that's not identical across different sensory modalities. It might be that there's some genetic predisposition for alterations in molecular pathways that are more specifically associated with the temporal cortex. But it might be just an issue that, in humans, there tends to be more or less noise in one of the modalities. But what we know is clinically, these things are not equal. It's true that patients can have hallucinations in different modalities, but they tend to have them more so in the auditory modality. And in particular in speech, right, which is speech and other more complex patterns, which again suggest an involvement of higher, like more associative regions of auditory cortex, perhaps. But so that is that would be my first approach. But what I'm saying is that, like I said, when we are comparing hallucinations and delusions, we still think that there might be to some degree symptom-specific pathways, and there could be symptom-specific pathways even for different modalities of hallucinations. We don't understand why those things sometimes tend to go together. Sometimes they tend to be more prevalent for one modality. That I can't answer. But we have done some work, for instance, in the emergence of psychosis in clinical high risk with Psychiatric in the clinic. We saw that hallucinations in the auditory domain were predictive of higher likelihood of conversion to psychosis, where visual hallucinations tend to be predictive of lower risk of conversion. And hallucinations in the auditory modality were more correlated with the other core symptoms of psychosis, like initial beliefs and such. So there seem to be differences there. I wouldn't think a priori, based on the phenomenological studies, that these are all exactly identical. But that's a super important question to try to address with future work.
Interesting. Great. Dr. Lieberman, I think you had a question also.
I have a bunch of questions, but just in terms of what you were responding to Jonathan about, this is a little bit far-fetched, but there was a theory advanced by a psychologist from Princeton named Julian Jaynes a number of years ago called breakdown of the origin of consciousness, the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And it was not based on empirical research, it was based on kind of historical archival literature. And he reasoned that if you look at ancient texts like the Iliad, behavior of the individuals was controlled by their their verbal directives that were perceived auditorially from the gods, Agamemnon and Achilles and so forth. And Odysseus was the representative of the more highly evolved individual, because the epithet was wily Odysseus. And he was able to use a greater degree of cunning and savvy to, outwit the gods and to also function in his societies. But the point is that the gods didn't communicate so much by smell or touch or vision or so forth. They communicated by voices. So the implication was there's some evolutionary reason why the auditory modality was being used in a way, and also maybe one that was more vulnerable to disturbance for disease. Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely the other important point, which is that, as humans, our brains are tuned to information, to types of sensory data that are more socially relevant and informative to us, right? And we know that they're like, phase selective regions. We have a big chunk of the temporal cortex that is selectively responsive to speech. And I think that probably socially the most informative thing is speech, you could argue, right? And so, through experience, we give more real estate to things that are more important, that are more predictive of the rewards that matter to us. So maybe that's part of, the kind of the prominent position of speech in terms of its social informativeness and relevance might be what makes that particularly susceptible. But another view could be that the alterations might be, on the other hand, more, say, genetic or circuit level alterations that kind of release activity on a particular nigrostriatal pathway that projects to part of the striatum, like the associated striatum, that happens to receive higher order information and integrate that information. And that's why these more complex patterns tend to be more disrupted than simpler patterns.
Have you tried to manipulate perceptual inference by manipulating dopamine levels?
So in the study that I mentioned, so we definitely want to go in that direction. The only time we've done that was when we collected data from the tone reproduction test that I mentioned, pre and post amphetamine. And I didn't show that data because it's a little more complicated. It's not like everyone starts having biases just like what we see in people with hallucinations. But we did see an effect whereby, depending on the baseline biases, if one has already biases that look like what I was calling the low uncertainty adjustment, amphetamine didn't seem to do much. But if they had more uncertainty adjustment, then amphetamine made them look closer to the hallucinators.
Well,
So
the dose or the repetition to induce this alteration in perceptual inference is likely different than it is for the dopamine displacement that is used for receptor imaging.
Yeah, that's those might be important. Repeated administration would be great to do. So that's one direction that we want to go into, and combine this imaging behavioral methods with pharmacological manipulations to try to understand whether you can really cause this type of alteration. There is one unpublished paper that speaks directly to this, and they showed that with L-DOPA, they could drive false percepts in healthy people, but it's not, I guess, it's not published.
We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to try to rapid fire get through a couple more questions that people have written in. So there's a question, you've developed an elegant Bayesian model that is process-oriented. What about the often bizarre content of hallucinations and delusions?
So I think that's a very important question, and we're actually working on extensions. The tricky thing there is that we don't know that there's really a characteristic content of hallucinations and delusions. We know that it's culturally dependent. It changes with different generations. And obviously, a lot of delusions that have to do with the internet that didn't, weren't reported before. So what we're trying to do is focus on the formal features rather than on the content, because we think that that's the most stable and most defining features. That said, one of the directions that we're taking is to try to explain the valence of delusions, which might be also relevant to hallucinations, because the symptoms tend to have a negative valence. They tend to be personally relevant. They tend to have some valence that is not neutral, and predominantly negative valence. And that seems to be a more stable feature that you could relate more directly to the content. So we're trying to use different computational models, including of something called the optimism bias, to try to understand whether these prior biases that I talked about, how they interact with this other type of biases that typically lead people to have more positively valenced beliefs, to see if there's an alteration, or it has to do with the comorbid depression that we tend to see in schizophrenia, and negative mood associated with things like delusional mood, that would set up the stage for, thinking that something bad is going on, which combined with this prior bias might lead someone to have a rigid, high conviction belief that tends to have this very negative valence that something very bad is happening, is explaining someone's experience.
Great. So I think this is going to be our last question. So you suggested that the anterior cingulate cortex is likely involved in updating priors and computing posteriors. Is there general evidence for that? And might there be training programs that could make individuals less reliant on priors?
So there is convergent evidence for that in both monkey electrophysiology and definitely in fMRI studies in humans. That essentially activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate tracks with changes in beliefs, and the magnitude of the change in activation when sensory evidence is received can be modeled as a function of belief updating. And in terms of how to modulate that, I think that probably one way to modulate that might be TMS or different neuromodulation approaches. The problem with those is that it's hard to modulate things in a particular direction. Like your question implies you want to correct the deficit in a particular way, not just reduce activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate. You want to modulate it in the right way. So that's why we're trying to do this type of decoded neurofeedback, because it's more about determining a particular pattern of activity and trying to shift brain activation towards that pattern, one desired pattern in one particular direction. So that perhaps will give us more functional selectivity, and we'll be able to correct that. But presumably different types of cognitive training, maybe targeted cognitive training, could help with that. I don't know of any work that has shown that a particular training approach would correct this deficit in the direction that we would want it to correct it.
Okay, great. So I think we're out of time, but any final words, Dr. Lieberman or Guillermo?
Well, I'll just say that the work is extremely innovative and creative, and also courageous, because I don't think phenomenology has kind of been a graveyard for researchers, and since Carl Jaspers or maybe Kurt Schneider, there hasn't been a really important focus on it, much less to try and link it to its neurobiological underpinnings. So it's impressive to see, Guillermo, and we're right behind you, waiting to see what comes next. Just to say also that the next grand round, next week is Labor Day, so there won't be grand rounds, but the week after we have Ned Kalin, who is at the University of Wisconsin and also is the current editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry. So, Jonathan, thanks for moderating. That's all I have to say, and I want to wish us all farewell. Till the next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks everyone, bye.